Alright, so because I don't know what's good for me, I have yet again changed the format of the labeling of the video. So hopefully this ends up being the final iteration. I don't have very many hopes for it. This video is not about a specific build's performance, I suppose, as much as its history. So very much like the other video, which was talking about the Goliath and Bastion combination. This is going to be looking explicitly at the Toadfish one that I've been running recently. So I've gotten some hate mail for running this from other people. So the good news for them is that I have actually finished the crossbow trial for, the Toadfish, as of like right meow. So that marks the end of me using them and most likely shelving them or selling them and not touching them for another long while, because while they seemed rather effective, I'm not really a fan of how they perform, at least in this version I've done. I figure if I ended up using them again, I'd probably want to do something like running a shelf of them. So like how spiders will sometimes have a rack on the back and then putting them there just so that the projectiles are consistent. I found that having them staggered on a plank, while fairly effective, especially in CQC, which was my main concern with them, is pretty useful for obviously being able to fire in most directions, including behind for pursuers. The natural change in elevation and depth from the target means that when you're engaging in very far ranges, which is exactly what I was trying to do with him, you still tend to get quite a bit of spread. And since the weapons are perfectly accurate, the spread doesn't seem to be affected by other co-drivers or even things like the Torero cabin. If so, then minimally. So having them all on one like flat level, maybe trying to run again with the Torero or with a character who changes spread while moving or something like that might be useful, but for the sake of I was feeling pretty confident with this build and almost done the trial, I didn't really feel like doing a whole build from scratch again. So to go over the history of this build, this is the final iteration, which I've been using at sub 9500 in order to avoid getting put into as many 13,000 lobbies, which tends to be a very real problem for at least players on Xbox for the time zone or region, etc. that we play at. Even now, we've been in, even now today, or while at sub 9500, we've been put into 11, 12, 13, 14,000 lobbies. I'd say probably 1 in 5 matches. When you do above 9,500, it's closer to 1 in 2, which just sort of becomes no longer playable, especially since randos, even the high power score ones, have a bad habit of just rushing off solo, dying, and then now, okay, well, it's a 5v6, and none of us on our team are as high of a power score as theirs. So this is the final iteration. Going to do sort of a build up from where it started to now, rather than just looking at the steps in reverse, but I will discuss a couple of the end results. So obviously we have the Toadfish. They are staggered so that each one behind is 2 pips above, and as you can see, arguably 3 pips away if you count from toe to base. Wow, the console companion is having issues connecting today. Hopefully that doesn't end up dropping the stream. But this specific spacing I found let them work pretty well. You can almost shoot straight in front of you, and then you can obviously shoot around you pretty well. So this was the original sort of spacing I had on them, and I didn't change, even though I've changed cabins and a couple of other pieces of gear. But currently have it set as the Deadman cabin, which I had the most success with. So while the specific perk of this only being a 10% reload time reduction is not maybe the best in slot, the fact that it's a reload time reduction rather than a reload speed increase has an outsized effect, as I've mentioned in the really long Reddit thread I talked about a little while ago. And then if and when, which tends to be very frequently, I end up losing one or more of the Toadfish, then I get the outsized bonus of the 15 or 25% on the remaining one. In theory, I haven't actually timed it and seen if there's a difference between having 1 and 3, but I imagine like other perks, it updates on the fly. Could totally be wrong about that. The other energy is being supplied by a ampere, and on this build, that is used to power a oppressor engine. Gives me, obviously, tonnage. Power is rather important. Max cabin speed is really useful since I'm already running a light cabin. I can book it pretty fast. And then most importantly, the perk, which allows me to rotate the weapons closer in CQC, which has been a big benefit. Then the other part is the flywheel for obvious reasons. For additional hardware components on the build, I have the iris allowing me to snipe without trying to find a good place to put a scope on this build, because as you see, the toadfish is like by volume more than 50% of it. So I felt like trying to put a scope somewhere wouldn't go too well, so the addition of that new module worked out just fine. We have a radar on the back. That is to trigger the Falcon's perk, or sorry, Falcon, the co-driver's perk from further away, especially because I've been trying to snipe with it. So being able to target somebody, 150, 200, 300 meters away and get the perk active is quite nice, as opposed to just using the default of whatever it is, I think like 100 meters maybe. Additionally, we have a fuel tank underneath the build. We did have a fuel barrel in a prior iteration, I'll get to that. We have ammo packs, and then we also have a radio slapped underneath the iris because it sits quite nicely and makes it a nice 2x2x4 square of modules. So when I started with this, I very much had the same spacing, but I originally used the Janabi cabin, which gives increased damage while drifting, alongside a hot red engine, and then a big G generator instead. So that still sat me at the sub 9500 mark. It was originally a sub 10, but like I said, ran into problems with queuing against 13,000s very frequently. So I ended up swapping that out pretty early on. I played around with a couple of different wheels. The APC wheels were especially helpful when I didn't have the oppressor engine equipped, since that allowed me the ability to actually max out my tonnage and thus mass. Didn't really have the ability to just lose a bunch of wheels and still be at full tonnage. So for instance, if I were to show, what would be the easiest way of doing this? So for instance, currently I can still lose my wheels, quite a few of them in fact, and still not have issues with tonnage. So I can literally lose, I think, all of my steering wheels without it being a problem. Yeah. But that's due largely in part due to the oppressor, which gives basically 2,000 additional tonnage to the build on top of the 1,000 that goes alongside the mass limit. So when I had the Janabi and then was only running the hot red, I needed significantly more tonnage. And of course it'll be over mass here because I haven't changed the build in the meantime. And I also needed pretty much every single one of those wheels to actually hit the limit. So was basically using the Janabi and then the hot red to try and hedge up on the weaknesses of the toadfish, which is that inevitably, especially in Crossout, where there's a very heavy preference currently for CQC combat and builds, that people would roll up on me and the toadfish would be, somewhat ineffective at very close range. Surely their perk, which allows you to deal impulse and flip builds, can be useful, but most builds tend to have a low center of mass, so trying to just flip them in CQC ends poorly, especially when you look at things like avalanches or shotguns or melee or fire dogs who tend to de-gun you really quickly. You don't generally have the option to fire off more than one volley, and if that volley doesn't flip them, then you're sort of SOL. So by having it with the hot red, the hope was to be able to backpedal faster, so it would also let me actually dodge corners a little bit easier. So for instance, right now I'm limited to 34, which is rather slow for my back speed, whereas I can of course go the full 117 or whatever the number is forward. So that allowed me to peak forward and back on. Okay, I'm just going to restart this app because it seems to be really struggling here, and normally it doesn't. See if that's any better. I'm not still having network problems immediately, so it might just be an unlucky day for me to be trying to do this. In any case, having the significantly increased back pedal speed, which I don't currently have, means that I was able to peak corners either forward or backward, and then in some cases I could actually backpedal people using the impulse from the weapon to keep them away. So, not the case with the current oppressor. It again did save me quite a bit of power score with the energy drop from having 2 epic modules for energy for 1. That being said, Hot Red is now the full 275 power score compared to the oppressor engine, which is 275. The Hot Red used to be slightly lower at the 216 as a non-energy consuming purple tier item, but whatever, they changed that. There were a few problems with that, namely I wasn't consistently drifting effectively, so the Janabi's perk was effectively wasted. Even in CQC I tended to want to try and drive straight away from people in order to save my guns, allow the back to soak up damage, and I mean just drifting in general is difficult. So the next upgrade I was looking at doing is I swapped out some of the armor, which was lighter parts like the fire starter parts, higher power score but lower overall durability and lower overall mass, because the Deadman is a mass fuse cabin and has a higher mass limit to start with, I think, which is kind of crazy. And then the Janabi is, wow, not. So I looked at making the big G and amp here instead, and then slapping on the oppressor engine. The big problem with that is having the Janabi and the oppressor together doesn't really work just because of how long each of them are, and the oppressor's rather awkward shape, namely being that it's 3 high, even though from the look of its profile it should only really be 2 high for the vast majority of it. But that's not the case. It's basically a 3 by 4 by, no, this is 7. So having the Janabi, which is also like a 7 long cabin, what is this? 6, 7, 8, 9 long cabin. Doesn't work. The build gets pretty long pretty fast, but in any case I poked around with it, and then because I didn't need as much tonnage I was able to swap out the wheels for camber wheels, which allowed me to drift a little bit easier and dropped the chassis closer to the ground. Didn't really find too much more success with that. The camber wheels were a lot less durable and tended to be stripped a lot more easily, so I was looking at maybe going the other route and making it tankier instead. So for a very brief period of time I ended up running it with the Torero cabin instead, so a monster for mass in comparison. So while only losing 5 kph as a pseudo light cabin, I gain a lot of max mass due to it actually being medium, not to mention it being fused for mass, which of course exacerbates the difference. So I poked around with that. The problem is the acceleration difference between the two is like ridiculous. It's not even close. Let's see if I can, yeah, I can't even fit it currently with all this stuff on it. Let's see if easy adjustment. Kind of. There we go. So even if I put there and then don't even hit the max mass, it just takes so much longer to hit a reasonable speed, and then of course when you put on the max mass as well, it again makes that quite a bit worse. So going the super tanky route wasn't any better for me. I felt like I still needed to keep my mobility, additionally because the Torero doesn't do, or doesn't at least feel like it does, a significant effect on like tightening the shots. Like, I mean, you literally can't even see them move or spread in between the volley. I kind of figured that it probably wasn't the route I wanted to go. So at that point I looked at using the Deadman, which is obviously what I ended up sticking with for the remainder of the trial. Though it was actually an additional pip back. So I had this crossbar which was connected to stuff at the front, and then I had my fuel barrel, fuel tank, and iris all sitting pretty underneath here. So it was looking like that for a while. Obviously with the toadfish and some armor mass stuff rearranged, the reload booster slapped back on as well. But I did find that it was rather volatile, so I did an overhaul a couple of nights ago where I get the spacing wrong immediately, I'm sure. No, perfect, lovely. I found that while this combination worked well, especially as I mentioned for the whole options for the having fuel for winds and everything, I found that it was really, really good at blowing up. So you could see even without the Falcon Co-Driver active perk thing, I basically lost 2/3 of the build just by doing that. And as a result, you lose, multiple toadfish. So that's when I shoot the ammo pack on the side. I can also shoot, of course, the amp here on the front, which has a rather similar effect while maintaining the middle of the build. And then if I shot the back, the rest of it basically blew up. So likewise, if I shoot the back to begin with, so used to having the triple burst, so when I was testing this before, I'd just shoot like the one burst and then like look away for the second volley. So as you can see, again, the build is basically completely ganked. So I was trying to stay away from that. I was somewhat intelligent to begin with by having things like, for instance, the ammo pack connected to the amp here. So you could see that that was by far the most devastating to the build. So now, the entire time, this wasn't a new revelation or anything. The amp here was holding the ammo packs up. And generally speaking, I wasn't getting blindsided in a way where people would hit the ammo packs explicitly first. So what happens a lot of the time is if people do pop the amp here, it would blow up the ammo packs. The ammo packs would no longer be anchored, so they wouldn't blow up and cause further issues, which was rather convenient. Then I kind of realized the Deadman fits in this notch. Tried combining the words there very nicely. So I can actually semi-wrap it around the oppressor. Unfortunately, the toadfish being there does not approve of that. So I instead looked at pulling the oppressor back instead, which is kind of what you see here. The entire front part of the build got shifted backwards. So additionally, there's a space here behind the toadfish where there doesn't need to be. It's actually fine with having an item there. I did originally have the hot red like right behind the toadfish, but in any case, it doesn't need the space, so I can actually push that forward. It compacts it a little bit on the back. I'm able to slap in the modules. As you can see, I relocated the iris, and then I ended up removing the fuel barrel, the small one. So I ended up just keeping the fuel tank underneath, and then replacing that power score at the radio, which is literally the same power score. So the end result I currently have, which is the one that I feel like I had the most success with, is this. So as a result of the amp here being located where it is and having the stuff connected to it, we have only one toadfish gone, which ends up working out for the sake of our energy drain. We lose our generator, so we'd lose one of our guns anyway. It keeps the engine intact, which is what the second toadfish is mounted on, which we can also use as frontal armor, and obviously it doesn't affect the back of the build too much. And to reiterate, the amp here removing being the anchor point for the ammo packs and thus losing both when one blows up was, again, something the entire time. But even now, you can see losing the ammo pack is pretty devastating, so mostly banking on that, again, not occurring, which for the most part it hasn't, even with all the avalanches. As I mentioned on the Reddit when people were discussing the avalanche and it supposedly needing a buff, which I feel is too soon to say such a thing. It didn't really have a whole lot of people shooting under my build and popping stuff. They're mostly shooting at my build, so side armor was able to deflect a lot of that, or tank it rather, especially the APC wheels, which have innate blast resistance. Then if I lose gas tank just by itself without the fuel barrel also being there, I can actually end up keeping all of my wheels. The only thing I lose is just that. Obviously things around it get weakened, but it's not too bad. So the main benefit of doing it this way by pushing it forward is I can actually have a redundant frame setup again. because beforehand, when the dead man was pulled back one, it was just connected to this 1x6, and then the 1x6 was connecting all of the front frames. So if that 1x6 went, I'd lose all the front frames. Now, by having it pushed one closer, I have the 1x6 there, where it sticks out, as well as the one on the side. So I can actually lose one or the other and still be fine, which is also what happens when the fuel tank blows up. It doesn't destroy the other 1x6s. So this ended up being the sort of best version of the final one for me. Obviously, you still have the flywheel, iris, and the radio mounted at the back, kind of using them as pseudo armor. As far as what one could probably do if they want to iterate on this some more, I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I'm the best Toadfish user by any means. I didn't record a whole lot of gameplay footage for this just because I wasn't streaming, and I managed to get the entire trial done in like 1 week. We've been basically no-lifing it. So we're actually very close to the scrap cap, hit the intelligence cap, and then about halfway on the wires cap for this week. And that's not normally the case. That was very much a result of just having time and interest in doing PvP this week with the new Toadfish. So it's been rather effective. I still prefer staying far away, sniping people as much as I can, because if you get in the CQC, you have the obvious limitation of not only reload weapons, but even with the aggressor at max speed, people can still spin around you all day if they're really interested in doing so. And you sometimes still have an issue getting the shots off on people if you're drifting. So could very obviously, if you weren't worried about power score, you could swap out some things. Like you could swap the Ampere for the P1 charge, put it at the back, armor it up a little bit more. Swap out the wheels would be the big one, since these things are extremely heavy, 250 kilos each. You could swap them out for something like the Hermit, which is only 110 each. Once again, bumps up your power score, but these end up being more durable, especially due to their perk, which shouldn't be an issue for one hit. You lose a significant amount of power penalty, so you can accelerate to top speed faster. You can obviously look at armoring the weapons a bit more. As far as this particular style, I don't think I'd change the cabin or the engine. Again, you could look at doing something with the hot red if you weren't worried as much about being able to rotate fast in CQC. Or you could even drop quite a bit of power score by swapping out one of the Toadfish for something like Trombone and a Cap Can. Or, you know, whatever. But I felt like, again, for the sake of me having 3 Toadfish, I felt like it was pretty straightforward, pretty effective. One of the things I like to poke a lot of fun of is, even though I didn't feel like I had space or the ability to withstand explosions on this build for both the fuel barrel and fuel tank, it was very effective at getting fuel. I know people say, oh, don't use fuel, it's just a waste, but I mean, I continue to say, I mean, it literally doubles the monetary value of your runs if it works. As you can see, you can be rather effective. Like on here, I only have one loss that resulted in, or sorry, one win that resulted in not getting fuel, which is to say most of the time the fuel tanks lived. It's, I think, a big matter of actually just knowing where to put them intelligently so that you don't have issues with losing your build. So for instance, wasn't uncommon for people to maybe pop the Ampere, of course. But even if people blast apart most of your build with something like an avalanche, oopsie, other than when you get pushed into barrels, you don't generally lose your fuel. There was quite a few times where it was literally just me and my fuel tank, since it was directly underneath my cabin and thus unaffected by most other things. And like that was it for what was left on the build, but I was still able to get the fuel because my team won. Or if we lost, then I mean it was a loss anyway, so that wouldn't have been a difference for the actual fuel. A lot of time too, of course, people just strip you and then leave you with nothing else, and in that case, as you can see, I mean, the fuel tanks are still equipped, or sorry, the singular fuel tank is still equipped and rather undamaged. Still have a bit of actual cabin health as well, since a lot of this build is people just focusing on weapons rather than the cabin itself, and having 1300 health is pretty durable. Another thing that I was actually kind of surprised with is how powerful the Toadfish are if you actually land their shot. So an entire volley is 840 damage. What that means is that if you have the perk active from Falcon, who is my co-driver of choice for sniping. You can actually one volley lots of different things. So you can one volley elephants if they don't have their perk active, i.e. if you're the first person to react to the other. You can hit, you know, train plows in half a volley. You can strip kaiju in 2 volleys. Very, very powerful. If you're able to get the perk, you're able to consistently land the shots. The biggest problem is, of course, just, you know, dog builds, fire builds, CQC builds in general tend to really ruin your day with this. I did overall not mind it. Again, it was probably one of the more successful builds. I mean, if I stop streaming and if I look at the display captures I did instead, I mean, of course, I'm only, you know, cherry picking when we didn't get like 10 failed runs in a row. But there was a few times where I grabbed screenshots where it was, that's actually not related to this. Maybe I didn't grab screenshots. I could have swore I told it to. But may have been either not uploading or I may have already deleted them for some reason or another. In any case, I mean, I guess it'll just be a just trust me bro sort of moment. But it was pretty frequent where I'd be getting, at any 10 given matches, have a significant amount of wins. I guess I could check it this way. I'm just going to over at the garage with a placeholder that I've been using for raids. Because whenever I open this app up, it tends to disconnect me. Yeah, and this is all plastic again down here. But for instance, I have this screenshot from earlier today, which again shows getting 10 matches, 8 of them being wins, all of those wins giving fuel. And then the only 2 losses not giving fuel because, well, doesn't give. Looks like that didn't get queued for uploading for whatever reason. But in any case, having it here shown on screen is probably good enough. Guess it also means I have more culling of my Xbox storage to do, unfortunately. There's also quite a few clips that I ended up getting with it, just as a rather effective build. Don't know if I'd want to bother adding all of those here, because it will easily double the length of the stream, which is already pretty long for just showcasing one build. So what I'll probably end up doing is looking at going through them, trimming them, and then afterwards maybe uploading them alongside here, taking this video down and re-uploading them. But in any case, I'd say it was a pretty effective build, one that I would certainly recommend looking at if you're looking at a lower power score, not dealing with, you know, people running relics build for the toadfish, especially since the crafting cost for them was reduced as per my post a couple of weeks, maybe months even at this point back, where they had the work pieces from the arena event ended up being only like 4,000 coins to craft when they're normally like 6,000-7,000. So don't think there's a whole lot more to say on the build, other than if you are one of the people who sent me hate mail recently. The good news is you're not going to see a whole lot more of me running this build. That being said, the other weapons I'm going back to using are going to be the Avalanche, the Heather, the Mandrake, the Hammerfall or Nidhogg or Parser. The remaining legendary trials, I'm actually very close. I think I only have 4 legendary ones left. So there's obviously the relic ones. And then all of the ones that are labeled legend are relic. So one, which is the Mandrake, or the erroneously labeled Heather currently, or suspected to be erroneous. Grenade launcher, the Retro, which I'm already halfway done. Cannons, which I'm already halfway done, but now I have the Avalanche, so I don't need the Tsunami or Mammoth anymore. And then the shotguns, which I have a little bit of progress with, but I ended up just flipping the items, so I'll need to go back and continue. So, in any case, if you thought this build was bad, no guarantee that you will like any of the other ones anymore, since I'm probably going to be continuing to play around the 9,500 power score mark, because I don't really care to seal club, nor do I care to go up against 13,000s with 9,000, 10,000 power score builds. So you'll probably continue to see a lot of me, and most of the other weapons I've just listed are ones that I'm a lot more interested in using and perhaps keeping, whereas the Toadfish were sort of just a means to an end. So we'll see how it goes in the future.